Hey everybody, Maverick Christian here. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." In this episode, I'm going to use a historical example of racism regarding cultural influences, delving a little bit into normative ethics, the branch of ethics concerned with what is actually right and wrong in the process. Part 1. Defining terms. By racism, I mean prejudice, antagonism, or discrimination against a particular race, such that if one deliberately treats one race worse than another race on the basis of race, that's racial discrimination. Note that this definition of racial discrimination also includes preferential treatment on the basis of race, because if you deliberately treat race A better than race B, you're deliberately treating race B worse than race A. For example, if a company gives all its white employees a raise just because they're white, and doesn't give its non-white employees a raise because of their race, well, then the company is treating white employees better than non-white employees, and thus treating the non-white employees worse than the white employees. That's racially discriminating against non-white people. At the risk of sounding controversial and divisive, I think deliberate racial discrimination is bad and sinful, that it is against God's will. So if one is in a world that tells them that such racism is good, Romans 12:2 offers some useful advice. Part 2. Historical racism. When I was growing up, I was taught that racism is bad. I sometimes reflected on what I had been taught and thought that what I was being taught about racial discrimination being bad was kind of obvious. Of course it's bad. Things like skin color are pretty superficial characteristics. It would be like discriminating against people on the basis of eye color. It just doesn't make sense. So why were some people racist? Well, originally I thought that racist people are just bad people, but as I grew older, I learned that the world is more complicated than that. More complicated than the world being neatly divided into categories of good people and bad people. In the past, racism was accepted even among relatively decent people because people found ways to rationalize their racism. And we have to be careful about that lest we be fooled by rationalizations ourselves. I think if you take a lot of ordinary decent people today, and if by some magic you erase their memories and put them in cultures in which their world was telling them that this culture's racism was good, they would conform to the racist pattern of that world. Even if, while in this racist culture, they read Romans 12:2 saying, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Resisting the pattern of the world is sometimes a difficult thing. If I were raised in the early 19th century United States as an ordinary white man, would I think that the racism against African Americans was a good thing? I hope I wouldn't, but I honestly don't know. Some people, I think, arrogantly assume that they would resist the racism of a racist culture, but given how history played out among the ordinary and decent people of the time, I think we should be skeptical because it's not as if those people of the past were different species. This was within the past few centuries. If I was in a culture that told me that the culture's racism is good and that I'd be a bad person for going against it, criticized, and maybe ostracized if I did, I'd be reluctant to speak out even if I knew the racism was wrong. Indeed, this may seem silly and maybe it is, but I was reluctant even to do this anti-racism episode about cultural conformity. I'll explain why I was somewhat fearfully reluctant later in this episode, then you can tell me in the comments how reasonable or unreasonable my fears were. The nature of human evil is to do evil to achieve something good, or at least some perceived good. You see, even in the case of a thief stealing money to spend that money on pleasurable activities, the thief is doing evil to acquire something good because pleasure is good. The same principle applies to deliberate racism. Even relatively and ordinary decent people, if raised in a culture that encourages racism, can come to accept racism because they're told that their racism is a means to achieve something good. A person might rationalize their racism this way, that their racism helps people. Sure, it doesn't help the people being discriminated against, but who cares about discriminating against those people? You know what those people are like? Those people have done bad things, and even if the individuals we're discriminated against haven't, they're of the same race of those who did. Doesn't it feel good to get back at this race that has caused such harm? It feels good, it feels right. But the attitude of racial resentment, of being antagonistic towards a race after feeling wronged by them, antagonism such as wanting to get back at them in some way, is wrong-headed for this reason if nothing else. People aren't colors, they're individuals. Other ways to rationalize racism have existed, like thinking black people are inferior and slavery is a way for the superior race to take care of the inferior people because the inferior people don't have the ability to take care of themselves. Enslaved blacks have food on the table and a roof over their heads. Some homeless people don't always have that, for example. Isn't being a slave better than starving to death? Slavery is actually good for the slaves. Some people have really argued for this. In addition to saying that slavery is good for the economy, and in a way it was good for the economy if you ignore the well-being of slaves, because it was good for the free white people who didn't have to do the work of slaves. Rationalizations for racial discrimination against African Americans existed in the early 20th century as well. Again, the idea was that the racism in question accomplishes some good. One of the lessons history has to teach us is that one way people can be fooled into embracing deliberate racism is rationalization. Again, the nature of human evil is doing something bad to accomplish some good, or at least some perceived good. So when someone tells you that we should do something bad like being deliberately racist to achieve something good, maybe exercise some healthy skepticism. Part 3. Sorry for being controversial. I apologize if what I'm about to say is controversial and divisive, but I think it needs to be said. Racism is bad, and we should have laws against racial discrimination, like laws forbidding the government from engaging in racial discrimination when it comes to things like employment, education, and so forth, because racial discrimination is bad. I apologize for being so controversial and divisive. Some people might think I'm being dryly humorous about being controversial here, but I'm actually kind of serious. Behold Article 1, Section 31 of the California State Constitution prohibiting the state from engaging in racist and sexist discrimination. Here it is in its entirety. I recommend reading at least Part A here because it gives you the gist of what this anti-discrimination law is saying. It says the state shouldn't discriminate against, quote, any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting, end quote. This anti-discrimination law prohibits racial discrimination in the sense that I defined the term earlier in this episode, in the aforementioned categories. Recall that my definition of racial discrimination includes racial preferential treatment, as the example of the company giving raises only to white employees helped illustrate, since the company would thereby be discriminating against non-white people. It may sound unbelievable to some who aren't politically savvy, but there were an awful lot of people in November 2020 who wanted to repeal this anti-discrimination law in order to implement racial discrimination. To California's credit, most California voters weren't in favor of repealing this anti-discrimination law, but over 40% did vote to repeal it. A significant minority, so this prohibition against racial discrimination is at least somewhat controversial, and this was one reason why I was reluctant to do this anti-racist video, because a significant fraction of the population, some of whom may be among my viewers, want racial discrimination, and just pointing out the obvious fact that this is actually racial discrimination might cause me to lose some viewers, even with the caveats that these people have good intentions, that they're not necessarily bad people. And to be absolutely clear, I don't think the people who want to eliminate this anti-discrimination law were necessarily bad people. I think they did have good intentions. A lot of people thought that their form of racial discrimination was good and helpful. And if you were to tell them, well, it wouldn't help the people you want to be racially discriminated against, one can imagine one of them saying, yes, but who cares about discriminating against those people? You know what those people are like? Those people have done bad things. And even if the individuals who are discriminating against haven't, they're of the same race of those who did. Doesn't it feel good to get back at this race that has caused such harm? It feels good, it feels right, it feels like the same old song of racial resentment. I myself have been tempted at least a little bit to engage in this sort of thinking. I can understand wanting to repeal the anti-discrimination law. But I'm reminded that one of the follies of racial resentment is that people aren't colors, they're individuals. Ezekiel 18 says that the soul that sins is the soul that shall die. People are not to be punished for the sins of their fathers, for example. For every man the righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. You don't even have to be of the Judeo-Christian tradition to see the logic in that. Other rationalizations for racial discrimination may also exist in this case, but racial resentment was one possible factor that came to mind for why one would discriminate against one race and not another here, largely because it's one that part of me empathizes with. So why did I pick out this California example of racism, especially pointing it out, would be so divisive. One reason is how remarkably well it illustrates my point. One can imagine a person doing the following. That person hears my idea of racial discrimination being bad, about outlawing it places like the government, and that person saying, "Why on earth are you apologizing for being controversial when it's completely obvious that the government shouldn't racially discriminate in places like employment and education?" But then I reveal that such racial discrimination has widespread support in that person's culture. They can be so influenced by that culture that that person quickly embraces that culture's racism. At one moment, racial discrimination was the most obvious thing in the world to be wrong. The next moment, rationalizations for racial discrimination are seized upon like a desperately thirsty man grasping for a glass of water. It's easy to imagine how such a thing could happen to a person. We have to be careful how our culture influences us, remembering Romans 12:2. Another reason for bringing up the California racism example is how popular and explicit it was because racism is often subtle. There's a documentary I recommend called Testing the Divide that exposes racism against African Americans among realtors in the Long Island section of New York. They sent a white person and a black person to the same realtor to see if they were treated differently. And they repeated this sort of experiment over and over again. Hispanics and Asians were also used. The investigation took years, dozens upon dozens of tests, and they tested all major Long Island realtor brands. This racism against African Americans appeared to be systemic, at least among realtors in this portion of the country. Hispanics and Asians were also discriminated against. But the racism was relatively subtle in that you had to do some real work to see if this was really happening. A Long Island realtor isn't going to post their racist policies on their website, for example, because that type of racism is both legally and socially unacceptable, thank goodness. In contrast, in the case of California Proposition 16 to repeal the anti-discrimination law during the 2020 American election, we have a type of racism that isn't so subtle. It's out there for the world to see. Anyone can go on the internet to see the anti-discrimination law that some people want to repeal to implement racial discrimination. So why does one type of racism have to hide itself, but the other one not so much? Well, one problem about learning the lessons from history about racism, prejudice, and bigotry is that when the same devil points at the same targets we're taught about in history class, we easily see the devil as evil. But sometimes when this same devil points at a different target, we somehow fail to see it's the same devil wearing the same sinister grin. I think that's an interesting phenomenon worth exploring. Part 4. Cultural Tactics Promoting Racism. How does racism get promoted? How does the same devil convince people when pointing at a different target? Well, words are pretty powerful. They can be used to manipulate people. Here are some ways that can happen. One thing to remember is that when things like racism and prejudice are encouraged, it's done so for the aim of some good, or at least some perceived good. So if you're tempted to embrace racism and prejudice for some perceived good, recognize that this is an old tactic. Those who advocate for a white ethno-state, for example, are concerned about the well-being of white people. And the well-being of white people is legitimate good, since white people have just as much moral value as people of any other color. But of course, this still doesn't justify racism. Another strategy is that if everyone is taught that racism is bad, one way to get around the problem is for the racist culture to not call the racism racism, and maybe encourage people to get angry and offended if they call the culture's racism racist. Basically trying to avoid labels like racism and racial discrimination from being applied to this racist culture. I've seen some advocating for a white ethno-state being resistant to being called racist, for example, even though white ethno-state clearly calls for some racial discrimination so as to include only white people. A third way a racist culture can use words to manipulate people is to use different terminology for the racism they want to implement. Give the racist policy or ideology some other label, something that sounds more innocuous. The term Orwellian refers to characteristics of George Orwell's writings, especially pertaining to George Orwell's classic dystopian novel 1984, which was published in the mid-20th century. Among the totalitarian dystopia's tactics was redefining terms or using terms differently to hide what's really going on. For example, the 1984 novel, the so-called Ministry of Truth, spread propagandistic lies. In Orwell's 1946 essay, Politics in the English Language, he wrote, "In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought." One Orwellian approach I've seen is to redefine the term racism so that it doesn't apply when someone racially discriminates against a race the racist culture wants to discriminate against. Regarding the 2020 California Proposition 16, an Orwellian tactic I found was this bit on a website advocating for repealing the anti-discrimination law. That's right, they're saying, we're fighting discrimination. Pretty Orwellian considering they want to repeal the anti-discrimination law to implement racist and sexist discrimination. Again, I think these people had good intentions, but I think it's better to help people without being racist. One of their ads said this:
Proposition 16 takes on discrimination
by giving it a great big hug and saying, welcome aboard.
It's supported by leaders like Kamala Harris and opposed by those who have always opposed equality.
Yes. It's those racists who want to outlaw racial discrimination. You don't want to be like the racists, do you? So let's repeal this anti-discrimination law so we can implement racial discrimination. That way we won't be racist. Yeah, it's some really good thinking there. After all, it's not racism as long as you say different racists oppose your racism. A fifth tactic, one that was sort of insinuated in the ad I showed, is to demonize the opposition. Notice the ad I showed had the chutzpah to associate the opposition with racists. It's a bit ironic to say the least, but the sad thing is this tactic might actually work. And I think a lot of people drank their own Kool-Aid on this measure. This is also a reason I was reluctant to talk about the attempt to repeal the anti-discrimination law and point out the obvious fact that some people clearly wanted racial discrimination here. Because I didn't want to get demonized either. Part of the reason I'm describing these tactics is that ordinary people are susceptible to this sort of thing. We're all capable of succumbing to cultural influence. I'm capable of it, you're capable of it, and we all have to be careful about not getting fooled when, for example, the devil of racism, prejudice, and bigotry points at a different target. Part 5. Consequences of Racism. Racism isn't merely annoying, it has real-life consequences. For example, when Long Island realtors racially discriminated against African Americans, they promoted racial segregation. And I think it's fairly obvious by now to most that we've had enough of racial segregation. As Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said, segregation is not only sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Deliberate racism is not only sinful, it can even be deadly. Sacrificing lives upon the altar of a racist ideology is certainly nothing new. Humanity did to those of African descent, to Jews and so forth. After all this history, are educated people capable of doing it again? In late 2020, vaccines were starting to be delivered during the notorious COVID-19 pandemic, but the new vaccines weren't going to be immediately available for everyone. They kind of had to come in waves. So how to distribute the vaccines? Like, who gets them first? Well, one vaccine strategy, one endorsed by the World Health Organization, is that the explicit priority should be saving lives. Well, seems reasonable and obvious enough. But another idea is that one's ethnic group should factor against certain people receiving the vaccine in the early stages, even if that causes more deaths in a global pandemic that by this point killed well over 1 million people. Sounds insane, doesn't it? How could we fail to learn from history in such a flagrant manner? It should go without saying that if you're caught up in an ideology that says to treat people differently on the basis of race in a way that causes more people to die, you should, to say the least, reconsider that ideology. When Coleman Hughes posted this tweet, I didn't believe him, but my previous experience told me that Hughes was highly intelligent and rational. So I checked the links he gave and I didn't expect to see what I saw in my lifetime. With the information available at the time, it appeared that if the goal is to save as many as we can, we should bias the vaccine delivery towards the elderly. A CDC report said much the same thing. However, in that same report, the ethnicity of the elderly actually counted against them receiving the vaccine here. Their lives became less morally valuable because of their ethnicity on this ideology. Does that sound familiar to anyone savvy in history? Clearly, one's ethnicity shouldn't factor against someone receiving the vaccine, not when it means more dead bodies. That would constitute a deadly form of racism. It's remarkable that in spite of all the moral progress we've made, we're that easily capable of making the same mistake all over again, sacrificing lives upon the altar of a racist ideology. How did this happen? What began as a movement for legitimate racial justice and equality became perverted into a dogma that would rather let innocent people die than abandon a racist ideology. An ideology capable of corrupting even intelligent and well-educated people before they realized what they became. Now, these people weren't monsters, they were ordinary people succumbing to the culture that they were in. The devil of racism wore a different suit, pointed to a different target, and any scruples of sacrificing innocent people to satisfy a racist ideology were rationalized away. The failure to learn from history led these people to be susceptible to a culture that tells them that their racism is ethically good, even if it meant that more people had to die. Part 6. Conclusion. I define racism as prejudice, antagonism, or discrimination against a race, with my definition of racial discrimination being that if one deliberately treats one race worse than another on the basis of race, that's racial discrimination. I used a hypothetical example of a company giving raises only to white employees just because they were white, thereby treating the non-white people worse than the white people because of their race, thereby racially discriminating against the non-white employees. I think deliberate racial discrimination is bad, sinful, and against God's will. I don't think we should be racist against any race. The history of deliberate racism, recent or otherwise, highlights the importance of Romans 12:2, which teaches us not to conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of our minds. One should be wary about rationalizations and other tactics to get people to conform to the pattern of the world they're in, especially when the world teaches racism, bigotry, or prejudice. In the case of certain people wanting to repeal that one anti-discrimination law during the 2020 American election, those people were in a culture that told them that their racism is good, even if they used Orwellian terminology to protect themselves from accepting that they're promoting deliberate racial discrimination. And yes, these people had good intentions. For example, they want to help people like struggling Latinos. Isn't it good to help the downtrodden and underprivileged? Of course it is. But we don't have to be racist to do it. You can be liberal, believe the government should take a large role in helping the underprivileged, while also believing that racism is a bad way to go about it. You can also definitely be liberal while believing that sacrificing lives on the altar of a racist ideology in a global pandemic is a terrible idea. So this video is not about left versus right. There's some on the right, and particularly the far right, who have problems with racism also. And there are some far right white nationalists and neo-Nazi types, for example. Not everyone on the left is racist, not everyone on the right is racist, though each side has some people advocating for racism. Again, this video is not about left versus right. This video is about resisting the culture and when that culture promotes and rationalizes bad things like racism and prejudice. And reminding people that this can still happen today. This episode is also about being mindful when the devil of racism, prejudice, and bigotry points at a different target. Because the same devil pointing at a different target shouldn't cause you to not notice that it's the same devil, even if your culture encourages you to not notice that it's the same devil. Ultimately, you have to think for yourself and be wary of conforming to the pattern of this world. Even apart from racism, there are behaviors commonly practiced today that will probably be considered barbaric in the future that in retrospect will seem sort of obvious, particularly given Jesus' commandments to love your neighbor as yourself and to love your enemies. If we applied logic and reason to loving your neighbor as yourself and consistently practiced this commandment, we wouldn't steal or kill or enslave our neighbor. We wouldn't be racist or sexist towards them. Even now, it must be admitted that we contemporary Christians often don't apply Jesus' commandment very well. For example, how many of us, including me, have used our money to buy something expensive we didn't really need, like an enormous television set, when that money could have been used to feed starving children? Did we really value having a large television over starving children being fed? Yeah, we kind of did. We kind of did value televisions over people, and that doesn't seem to be loving your neighbor as yourself, does it? In practice, God values us more than we value our fellow human beings. God was willing not merely to give up a large television, but to suffer the extreme for our benefit, to die and bleed on the cross. He did this not merely for those who loved him, but even for those who hated him. We Christians still aren't that good at displaying such sacrificial love, despite the very old example of God's Son. We're still barbaric, we're still conforming to the pattern of this world, a pattern that has a kind of selfish, materialistic bent to it among other objectionable qualities. So, when you want to chastise Christians and other people of the past who succumbed to accepting their racism in their world, recognize that we're not exactly living up to Romans 12:2 either. We're all still sinners in need of a Savior. It seems appropriate to say, and to say with all sincerity, God help us all. This is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.